Peace does not begin with presidents and prime ministers. It begins with you and me. It must be in our hearts before it can be in our homes. It must be in our homes before it can be in our communities. It must be in our communities before it can be in our country. It must be in our country before it can be in the world. But the process cannot be reversed. 5 people in Geneva, Paris, New York, or Washington cannot successfully negotiate world peace if they have no peace in their own hearts. And that's what this show is all about. How do we make your heart and my heart a place of peace? Hello everyone, Peggy Stanton here, your host on A Place of Peace. Today's show involves a place that has evidenced anything but peace. I'm, of course, talking about Afghanistan. The point being today, can you maintain peace in your heart, which is the point of this show, even under the most daunting, challenging of circumstances? And certainly, being an American woman serving in the military in a Muslim country qualifies in every respect. We have heard opinions on Afghanistan in news reports from sergeants to generals to secretaries of state and defense, all male. What about women who were actually deployed there? What about an opera singer deployed in southern Afghanistan as a senior social scientist on a human terrain team? And what is a human terrain team, for heaven's sake? AnnaMaria Cardinalli has been on this show numerous times, lending her lush contralto voice and talented fingers to classical guitar selections. What we've never heard from AnnaMaria is her amazing, fascinating, and sometimes frightening story, serving a year in southern Afghanistan. And that's the story we will hear today, so don't leave us. You're going to want to hear it all. Greetings, AnnaMaria. I've just, I haven't finished it. I've gotten through a whole lot of it, but your book, Crossing the Wire, and it's a fascinating book of selections from the diary you kept while you were in Afghanistan. And first of all, explain what Crossing the Wire means.
Well, there's a lot of books called Crossing the Wire, which I found out after the book was released, and most of them have to do with electronics, how not to cross the wires wrong. So,
yeah, we deal with that all the time here.
Look for that one. Look for Crossing the Wire, One Woman's Journey into the Hidden Dangers of the Afghan War. And what Crossing the Wire means, Peggy, is the way we refer to the last outpost of safety. So if you had a very, very, very far forward base that was deep into unknown or hostile territory, the wire would be the edge of the base. So once you cross the wire, you are in the life of the country. You're no longer under American military protection. You're on their soil. You would say you're in enemy territory if this war was anything but a counterinsurgency. But here's the thing. The Afghan people were never our enemy. We were never, ever against the Afghan people, and this became a deeply personal relationship with the Afghan people, this conflict became. So that's the interest and the tragedy and the uniqueness of this war.
Well, of course, the Taliban are Afghan, are they not?
Oh, they're indeed Afghan, but they are the violent extremists who terrorize the general good population who just want to have a peaceful life. Like Bloods and Crips gang members that terrorize American inner cities are in fact Americans.
Right. Well, you mentioned insurgency, counterinsurgency. This is something I suppose we should all immediately know the definition of, but I don't think we all do. So would you explain what you mean by insurgency and counterinsurgency?
Sure. So in the case of an insurgency, we have to imagine a very different kind of war than what we picture when we see war movies. We like to picture two clearly marked armies charging at each other across the fields. But that's not the battlefield that these kinds of wars are fought on. See, what happens is that insurgents are cowardly very often, at least the Taliban is. What they do is they hide themselves among the people. They hide within the population itself. Mm-hmm. And they terrorize the population, but don't identify themselves, obviously, to enemy combatants. So what ultimately happens is that you can't target a whole population. You're trying to find out who the hidden enemy really is. And the way you do that, that's what counterinsurgency is by building human relationships. You make relationships with the people of the country. You learn what their needs are and how to serve them, and what would empower them to stand up against the insurgents that terrorize them. I think the very best model of it is, like I was kind of saying, sort of like an inner city, right? Mm-hmm. In an inner city, people can be terrorized by the crime taking place around them, but at the same, and they're certainly not criminals themselves, but at the same time, because they're frightened of the criminals, they're not necessarily going to be the first to cooperate with the police efforts to get rid of the criminals either. But if you could get rid of those criminals that terrorize the neighborhoods, then normal people could just be safe and well to go on with their own lives. And that was always the goal of this war. It was, at least the American participation in it. It was always to free people to live their own lives. But to figure out how all that works, you need people to build relationships in the tiny communities, in the villages, in the neighborhoods, and find out how the Taliban is affecting people's lives, or how, in my analogy, the gang members are. And when you're doing that in a foreign country, it's even more complicated because you have to understand the nuances of the culture well enough to effectively accomplish that, which obviously, you're trying to overcome so much in order to manage that. And that's where the work I did, called human terrain work, comes in. That's the work of getting to know the people and the culture well enough to serve them well, and well enough to identify really where and how the enemy is operating.
Is that come under the heading of nation building?
Not in the least. The goal was always for the Afghans to build their own nation, just simply not for violent criminals to be in charge.
So, because that's become under criticism, and that we don't really succeed very well in nation building.
Oh, and no one does. I mean, no one can build a nation that's not their own. It's truly impossible. But if instead of looking at it in that lens, you simply look at it from a human rights perspective and say, okay, here's a regime that violently oppresses, let's say just right off the bat, 50% of the population of a country because they're women. Women themselves certainly don't want to live under what in fact is a life-term prison sentence because of their need to be confined indoors and be subjected to violence. Children do not, and my book goes very into depth into what happens to children. But if you just look at the population of women and children in that country, and you look only from a human rights perspective, we cannot leave. Anybody with a moral conscience couldn't see condoning a government like the Taliban to be in charge of those poor souls.
And you really stress that this is not what the people want. No. What person would want this for themselves? No, it's certainly not what the people want. But the Taliban did make inroads because some of and you talk about that, some of the local police and so forth were corrupt or lazy in the way they performed their jobs or didn't perform their jobs.
That's true, but the Taliban takeover having worked with the local authorities a great deal, the Taliban takeover didn't do a lot to lessen that laziness. There was one battle that sort of secured the Taliban's rise, and that was when two local warlords were fighting over the right to possess, to own, a slave boy. And in this fight, the two local warlords were so adamant about it that they destroyed innocent villages in the meantime. Now, Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban at the time, came and freed those villages. And so there was this moment when it looked like the Taliban had the moral high ground because they were punishing these men that were owning slaves and destroying villages. But in fact, the Taliban did as much and more of that in their rule, and continues to, than the local warlords did.
How do you mean they do more? They do more of
They
what?
do more violence.
Exactly?
They own more. They do more in terms of human trafficking and the owning of slaves, children and women, than the little small operating individual warlords they defeated.
Yeah, you talk about that. You say that the Taliban were very much against homosexuality, but they actually practiced it in de facto. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. It has to do with their understanding. So because the country is very poor, and because culturally and religiously they're bound to marry only when they can afford to pay the father of a woman an adequate dowry, very few men are wealthy enough to do that. So very few men can marry a woman. So it's become just a very, very, very embedded custom to consider boys from the time that, they're just out of toddlerhood, just out of their mother's care, sometimes as early as 4, sometimes as late as 7, until the age that they're able to grow a beard, to consider them to be women, to consider them to be appropriate to fulfill a woman's role. So that means that they're used for household chores, for cooking and cleaning and carrying and any sort of work you need done. And secondarily, and most horrifyingly, they're used as sexual toys, sexual partners. And it's not considered homosexuality because they consider a man being with a man homosexual. But if a boy hasn't grown a beard in this cultural context, they say, well, no, that's fine. No, it's criminal, is what it is. It's the trafficking and sexual abuse of minors.
Did America do anything to stop that kind of trafficking?
Well, that's the heartbreak of my life and my story. So, again, because my role was sort of to understand things culturally and discover these things, I discovered that to my horror. Mm-hmm. And when I brought it to my commanders, their initial reaction is the natural one you would imagine. It was that the U.S. needs to rescue any, or at least keep its eye out for any, what they would call young recruits within local police and military forces, and also to criminally prosecute under Afghan law these things, because, again, this is criminal activity, regardless of how culturally embedded it is.
Right.
So, and I thought that was a good outcome. In fact, my report on it went almost immediately to the United Nations, and they passed a resolution against the trafficking of minors in Afghan police and military forces. And I thought, this is great, we're doing so much good. But almost immediately after that, the U.S. government reversed its position, said that this was a cultural matter that we should not get involved in. The UN, they said that, and then what I discovered after that, horrifyingly enough, is that the U.S. was even on our own basis, sometimes paying for the services of these, what you would call dancing boys, male sex slaves, to entertain at the parties of our Afghan allies. So when I discovered that this was going on with U.S. funding, and that the administration had reversed our position in terms of condoning it. Now, the generals didn't. The administration reversed our position. And the UN, while it passed beautiful resolutions on paper, has done nothing about the enforcement of these things. And it's well known that the Afghan jurisprudence system will not enforce it. So there is a human rights, a nuclear bomb of horror going on in that country. And that's just about the children. That is not even looking at what the men and women deal with that don't want to live this kind of life. And that is the horror to which we have left this country. And for people like me, and this is why I say, if you have a veteran in your family, if you have anyone who's been there, even if you had anybody who fought in previous wars, you need to call them, you need to take them to lunch, you need to give them a hug. Because what they're remembering right now is that in order to fight this counterinsurgency, in order to fight on the level of hearts and minds of people, what they did is they loved the Afghan people. They got to know the Afghan people. They knew families personally. And they said to those families, we're not going to let this happen again to you. We're here for you. I'm going to cry. We're not going to let this happen. And in fact, this withdrawal, this Taliban takeover, has made liars of all of us who promised that, even though we meant it sincerely. And it's a moral injury that absolutely rends the heart.
But, of course, I guess that was a practice that had gone on for centuries? Was it only the Taliban who were engaging in this kind of abuse of human rights, or were all Afghan men doing this?
Well, certainly not all Afghan men, but it was a very common practice among the warlords, and continued to be a common practice among the local warlords, and then continued to be a common practice within the Taliban. The American presence was the only kind of light of hope for a while for the end of this, just like it was the only light of hope for women being educated, or towns learning to run businesses and become self-sufficient. It was the only window of hope for any of those things.
AnnaMaria, let's talk a bit about you being a woman over there and some of the experiences that you went through being on patrol, crossing the wire, so to speak, in a Muslim country. Now, for instance, that experience with the mullah, which is he a warlord? Is a mullah a warlord?
No, a mullah is the local religious leader who may or may not be a warlord. But it's interesting because sometimes the position is inherited. And sometimes the person themselves has absolutely no theological training. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they may have gone to a madrasa, gone to a school where they learn the Quran. But the Quran is in Arabic, and people in Afghanistan speak Pashto or Dari. So they may have even gone to school and learned to recite the Quran, but it doesn't mean that they actually know the meaning of any of the words they recite. If you can imagine someone going to Latin Mass, I've never known a Catholic to do this, but imagine someone going to Latin Mass and never knowing the meaning of the words. They can recite them, but they don't know the meaning. So when someone like that is in charge of a village, what they teach is not even necessarily Islam. It's just a combination of whatever cultural practices they've been taught. And very often, those are sort of the ones I described.
Well, describe what happened with this particular mullah. It was early on in your deployment, as I read the book, that you were out and a mullah took a liking to you.
Yes, and I didn't understand it. Again, as I was a blank slate going in, I didn't understand this. And so the thing is about, one of the reasons you need a woman to do this work is that half the population is secluded, and only women can speak to women and enter into women's homes, which is the only place women are allowed to be. So you got to have a woman do this work if women are going to be involved in the building of their country at all. So I'm out there, first patrol with a group, and I wasn't armed because my role was not at all to come across threatening, but only to come across as interested and desiring to learn and be a good neighbor. But I was assured that my patrol would stay with me. If any trouble arose, I had armed people with me. And that didn't end up to be the case. When things got hairy, my patrol moved on without me.
I was shocked. I was shocked by that.
Yeah, I was too. That was one of the first... because when you go into the military, one of the things that you really, I think everybody really loves about being in the military is the closeness, is the camaraderie, is the sense of intense and extended family you have with everyone around you, and mutual reliance. And so it's particularly devastating when that doesn't happen. But this mullah was very excited to meet a woman. And he said, you should come and stay at my house because I actually like women. Well, I didn't know. I didn't know what he meant by that. I just thought he meant he liked women. But what he was trying to tell me is that if I went anywhere else but there, the men weren't sophisticated enough to, how do I say this?
Appreciate you.
Yes, thank you. Well put. But he also didn't understand that I was, free and American and not property. And so he abducted me into his compound, and it was kind of, you have to read the book, it's a little bit of an adventure story how I got out, really by the grace of God, which is more and more evident in my life, and has become more evident in my life, certainly since I wrote the book.
Well, got you actually into his, not his tent, was kind of, what was that?
It's a compound, like if you can imagine, I live in Santa Fe, so we have big adobe walls, and so within his gated compound.
But the thing is, he got you in, and you did manage to get yourself out, but the shock was the patrol you would think that they would have put up a great resistance to you being pulled in there, or they would have come to your, but they did not.
Right.
Well, how do you explain that?
It begins to show you the human weaknesses that happen in war, and I absolutely forgive that sort of thing. But it is an interesting. If you're a woman thinking about going into the military, it's an interesting story to see how things just unfold naturally for you.
Well, then I certainly came away from feeling that combat or being involved in the military in anything except maybe administration, I just didn't feel that was a place for women.
Well, I have to on one level agree with that, except that there are circumstances, and this being one of them, where women are the only people who can do the work, certain work that's needed, particularly in the medical field and the intelligence field, in these countries where the entire country is gender segregated, because otherwise there's no interaction and no access to the women of the country. So American women have no choice, if they care about these people, than to act in these roles. And I'm very proud. I trained the first female engagement team for this work, the first Marine Corps female engagement team. And I was really, really proud of these girls, because a lot of them were originally people who went into the military for, like you said, like administrative purposes. But when the circumstance called on them in this way, they responded. And no, I don't think that women are inclined to war in any way or suited for war in any way that men are. But when a circumstance arises where they're the only ones who can, I was very, very, very proud of the way my sisters stepped up. Here's something that you brought up, and we are getting close to the end, so we have to make it shrink it a bit in explanation. But you talked about the fact, there was poppy and marijuana fields everywhere, and because medicinal treatment was so lacking, that with the constant intestinal problems that were abounding over there, that Afghans used whatever they could to treat these ailments. Sure, yeah. You use whatever's in your environment, yes.
And that thus people grew up kind of addicted. Is that true? Yeah,
that's the real tragedy of it. That's absolutely true. And so then you're not even dealing with an adult population that has ever really had, some of them really had the experience of not being on those drugs. There's a symptom called, and Joel Brinkley brought this up while he was alive, a wonderful reporter that I worked with, called environmental retardation. That doesn't mean that a person is retarded or has any real deficiency in their IQ or their potential, but because their environment is very, very limited from childhood and perhaps inundated with something like this, with drug abuse, that their adult potential is never reached. And under the Taliban and under the traditions of this country, what we're leading them to and what we're leading future generations to is that. And if we care for them, if we care for souls, and you have to remember too that the Taliban rule now is the death of Christianity in this country. Very literally, there are thousands of Christians there, and there are hundreds of Catholics, and they're marked for death. So, and an entire country of beautiful Muslim souls who under Taliban will never have the chance to be exposed to the truth of Jesus Christ our Lord. So, and will just live in terror and violence. So this is a situation where the need for prayer is absolutely, absolutely desperate. And if we can support the organizations that are getting people out, I think LifeSite News has one. I think there are some good ones. They need to be researched. We need to do more than pray. We need to help. And if there's someone out there who's listening to my interview and knows a way I can help, call Peggy or tell me. I'll do anything.
How do they get in touch? How do they get in touch with you? How would they get in touch with you, AnnaMaria?
I won't say my email on the air,
yeah, right.
But if they want to get in touch with you, you can send them my email. Is that all right, Peggy?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. All right, let's try to end on a note of hope. When you contemplate something like this, how did you, under so much stressful circumstances, how did you keep peace in your own heart?
I have to say that in these circumstances, this is an example where, on a purely human level, that's truly not possible. There is no peace in this, unless it is by the grace of God, except but for His grace, except for the access to the Eucharist that the brave priests who would get out there would give us. If it were not for the supernatural peace of Christ, of His Holy Spirit, then there would be no way to have peace in one's heart. And this is a perfect circumstance that illustrates this, because the tragedy of it is beyond human comprehension. And the tragedy now is worse. The stress and sadness I experience now because of the Taliban retake is worse than what I experienced when I was in country actually fighting.
Wow.
So, yeah, the only answer to how we have peace in a circumstance like this is through Christ.
Mm-hmm. And through prayer. We can't do much hands-on right now, but we certainly can prayer on, so to speak. AnnaMaria Cardinalli, there's so much more we could have talked about. Maybe we'll have to do another show on this. You had a fascinating and sometimes terrifying experiences in Afghanistan, but
and I'd love to talk to you sometime about the medical mission that's come out of that here in the United States with my little association of the faithful. So, yeah, I'd love that opportunity sometime. All
right, good. We've reconnected many times, usually in music, but this time we'll mission, hopefully, we can accomplish.
I cannot tell you how much I admire you and am so profoundly grateful to you for being a voice that gets the truth about these things out. You've always been and you continue to be, and thank you for that inspiration, Peggy.
Thank you very much, AnnaMaria. Join us, everyone, next week on A Place of Peace.